Should I go ahead and get started? Let's see how
I would
many.
go ahead, Anton.
Okay,
Just
yeah,
we don't want to run out of time for this section.
sure. So thanks everyone for coming back. In this second part of my hands-on, I'm going to show you how to launch a batch analysis. So I'm back inside of my fresh copy. I'm gonna go ahead and close this warning. And just before I go on, you'll notice that my notebook runtime has automatically paused. So it's currently paused, and you know this because instead of a pause button, there's a play button. So if I wanted to restart a notebook, I would have to restart my notebook runtime, either by pressing this play button or by going to that notebook and opening an editable version of the notebook. And then you would also see this play button turn into the starting up symbol and eventually into the pause button. But so again, one last time, I'll explain that that is separate from the type of analysis that we will do in this hands-on exercise. So in the previous hands-on exercise, I showed you how to launch a Jupyter notebook using the notebook runtime. Whereas in this exercise, instead of using Jupyter notebooks, we will launch a batch workflow. And doing the launching itself will be very simple. So hopefully we'll actually make up some time. Excuse me. Mostly we'll just look around the interface in this portion of the workspace. So before we go into a specific, pardon me. Before we go into a specific workflow, I'll point out that this is where you can search for workflows that are within this workspace, but also find a workflow either in the doc store. So you had a very detailed description of what the doc store is. This is how you can access containers that are in the doc store. So I could go here and browse for various types of tools, and then they would show up in this view. It would show up as one of these cards, or I can do it in row view like this. So I can find a workflow either in the doc store, or we also have our own Broad methods repository where you can go either to find other people's workflows or also to upload your own workflows if you want to make them available on the methods repository. And the same thing goes for doc store. So that being said, let's go ahead and go into this Genesis GWAS workflow. And you can see from this view some general information about the workflow. So you see the version of it, and in some cases you'll be able to select different versions. You'll see a link to the source where you can read some background information. If you wanted to, you can include an additional synopsis here. And then we have all of the control settings for the workflow below. I guess let's start by selecting our data and launching the workflow so that hopefully it can complete as quickly as possible for all the participants. So we'll do that by first clicking Select Data. So step one should have the sample set entity type selected. Make sure that it says sample set here and not sample. And I'll explain more specifically why in a moment. Click Select Data and make sure to stay on Choose Existing Sets. And the GWAS, for anyone who's familiar with the concept of genome-wide association, obviously needs to be run on a set of samples. So we would choose, that's why we chose our sample set table. This is the only entry we have in our sample set table. We only have one sample set. So we'll go ahead and select it. And you can see my OK button became activated. And you'll also notice that my Run Analysis button became activated. So before I had selected that data, the Run Analysis button, oh, well, now I have the data selected. So I can't unselect it because it grays out my OK button. But it, you might have noticed that before I selected that data, this Run Analysis button was also not activated. Now that it's activated, we can go ahead and run our analysis, click Run Analysis, and just go ahead and click Launch. And as soon as you click launch, it will take you automatically from your workflows tab to your job history tab. And this is actually the view for the individual job. So if I were to click on the job history tab again, you'll see the list view, which would list all of the jobs that I've submitted in this workspace, which for the moment is still only one. So I can go back again to the view, to the more detailed view for this particular job. And there's a whole bunch of useful information here, but also you can access much more detailed information by going to the job manager with this button right here. Just before I go there to show you, I'll point out that the status of this job right now is submitted. You might have noticed that right before it was submitted, the job status was queued. So when you first hit launch, the job becomes queued in the Cromwell execution server, and hopefully within half a minute, it turns into submitted. And it will stay on submitted until it either fails or completes. So in fact, let's see, if I refresh it, will it have already completed? Probably not. No. So if I click on view to look at the job manager, I can first of all see the list of tasks. And as you saw in a previous demonstration, the tasks are the things that compose the WDL script. So a workflow will be composed of a series of tasks, which might be either completed in tandem or in parallel, depending on how you've written your WDL. And you can see those tasks listed here, and you can also see the status of each one of those individual tasks. So the first two tasks have already succeeded, and now the final task is running. You can see various links in this view as well, so you can go to the execution directory like that. You can also check inputs and labels, and very usefully, you can check the timing diagram. So a lot of times when you're troubleshooting what went wrong with a workflow, the timing diagram is a very useful place to start. And it's also a very, very useful thing to reference for any support personnel that you're working with. So if you send us an email to ask us what's wrong with a particular workflow, one of the things we very commonly ask is to see the timing diagram, to see at what point the various actions failed. You'll notice these are color-coded. They're not color-coded in any specific ways. The different colors just represent discrete steps. So here's this little turquoise greenish sliver over here is one step, and then this blue block right next to it is the next step. Then this long red block is the step after that. So these steps all proceed in tandem, and once they finish, these steps proceed in parallel. And that's what the timing diagram is for. So we'll just go ahead and get out of here. Oh, just close that tab. Oh, and you can see my workflow has fully succeeded. And if your workflow isn't succeeded yet, you could hit refresh and see if that changes it. And if your workflow has a failed status here, you should post a question in the Slack channel, and we can troubleshoot. So that all being said, let's take a look at the results. You can either access the results by going directly to the Google bucket through the job history tab. As I showed you, there are several places that link you to the submission itself. Here's the workflow ID and the submission ID, and inside of the job manager, there were several links to the folders themselves, but also you can access the results in the data table very often. And in this particular case, the sample set that was in here at the beginning was already generated for you as a part of the public version of the workspace, because this is the input for the workflow that I just showed you. As I mentioned during the previous section, this sample set is actually generated by the notebook in the notebook section, and we just made sure that that output was already in place in the public version, so that it didn't matter which exercise you did first. However, if I deleted this sample set, then I could run my workflow only after I had recreated the sample set using the notebook. And again, there's a simple way to run the workflow from here if you so wish, by selecting that line, clicking open with, clicking workflows, and there you go. Those are the lists of the 2 workflows that are also in this section, in this workspace, I should say. And so this is where you can look at a lot of your results. So for example, you can see in these fields links to various files. So I can scroll all the way to the right and see this attribute for top GWAS results, and I can download this file. As we mentioned, what you're charged for on Terra are compute, storage, and egress. So downloading files is one of the things that could cost money. So there it's generating the download link. And once it does, it gives you a cost estimate. It's a very small file, so it would be very cheap to download. But that is how you would find out and how you would do it. And also you can see certain results directly. So for example, right here, we have our field for GWAS plots. And if I open this, I will actually see the Manhattan plots that we generated with this genome-wide association study. You can see this plot for chromosomes that are associated with different BMI-related outcomes, that being the example for this tutorial. So if you look more closely at the description in the dashboard and in the notebook markdown cells, it'll explain that the results we're reproducing here have to do with associating different BMI outcomes with different genetic attributes. And so that's basically how you run a workflow and how you monitor where your workflows are. I will finish out my section by showing you where there are a few more resources for you to explore. So as I mentioned, one resource that we like to point a lot of people towards is our showcase section of our library. So if you click on the hamburger menu to see the large left-hand menu, and then click on library to uncollapse this section, and then go to showcase, you will be taken to the showcase and tutorials section of the library. We have 3 different categories of featured workspaces. I guess I shouldn't use the term featured workspaces interchangeably for all of them, since one category and specifically is just called featured workspaces. And this category contains some general use cases, some preset, pre-configured environments, a few case studies that are useful for both getting to know how the workspace works and also seeing how reproducibility is done on Terra. We also have a section for GATK best practices workflows. So all of these workspaces contain workflows that are configured to GATK best practices guidelines. So if you are interested in working with our official production pipelines, then you can go ahead and use them. These are kept up to date. And then, as I mentioned earlier, we also have our new and interesting section, which we've recently introduced for any types of featured workspaces with more timely subjects. You can also go to the code and workflows section if you want to find individual workflows. You can go to the data section to explore different publicly available data sets. And then I also wanted to finish by showing everybody what types of resources are available to them. We have a number of tutorials and videos. So if I click on that button right here, it will call up this app queues pop-up. And this app queues pop-up will either take you to our YouTube channel full of introductory videos, or it will take you to one of these 2 quick start workspaces. So either of these are actually workspaces that are also like mini tutorials. So this one is the mini tutorial for using notebooks. This is the mini tutorial for using workflows. So it's a very useful feature to help you get acclimated. In addition to that, We have a number of different ways to contact us and to keep track of what we're doing. So you can either read release notes to keep track of what's happening. You can contact us directly with this button. You can request a feature, which is something we like to tell people to feel free to submit feature requests in case you find yourself doing something very tediously and you think, oh, I wish there was a simple button for just doing this action once rather than forcing me to do this action 50 times to get, a sample set up or something. But most importantly, I wanted to direct everyone to our tech support section, to our Terra support knowledge base. And here you'll find all sorts of useful documentation, particularly in the documentation section. I noticed one person was asking about developing whittles and if there are any instructional materials for that. You would find those right here under whittle documentation. So we have a whole bunch of articles here all about whittle documentation. We have whittle tutorials on how to write the whittles. Actually, before I finish, I'll show you where you can actually see the whittle that you're running when you run a particular workspace. First, I'll go back. To my workspace. So remember, this is the whittle that we ran. And if you want to see the script itself, you can see it right here by scrolling down. This is where the whittle inputs and outputs have been exposed to the user through Terra, and you can actually see the raw script itself. This isn't an editable field, so this isn't where you can do any type of development, unfortunately. But you can see the exact whittle that you're running by going to the script. And so that's about all I had to show you. I did want to respond to a question I heard during the break. Someone was asking about doing development for whittles. So I wanted to show, first of all, where you can find a bunch of useful documentation about this. And I also did a little bit of quick research to see if, what types of development environments, if any, are popular around here. And there aren't very many, unfortunately. It does sound like using Sublime text editor or VS Code are popular options. Those both have whittle settings, so those aren't strictly IDEs. They're only text editors, but they do have whittle settings, so you'll at least be able to keep track of the whittle format. And then also, I just found out that there is a Java-based IDE called IntelliJ that does have supposedly a whittle plugin, so that might work. I'm not terribly familiar with it, but that would be a place where you can develop whittles. Then you would upload your whittle and you would be able to see it right here. So with all that being said, I'll go ahead and open the floor up to questions first. And after that, if time permits, we might talk a little bit more about data access and organization.
Anton, I'll start the questions. Can you give us an idea of what the cost was for the workflow, the batch workflow that you just ran, and how much more expensive it would be with the non-downsample data and how much longer it would take?
So to give an idea of how much it would cost, I would suggest going to the dashboard. The dashboard has some very useful information about this. So here, for example, we have a cost estimate about $50, and another for also $50. And then in terms of what you would expect for non-downsampled processing, I'm actually not sure. Allie, I think you might have been trying.
Yeah, I'm trying to remember. I want to say about an order of magnitude, factor of 10-ish. It might be a factor of 8 or something. But I feel like that's about right. I don't remember. Oh,
I can
Beth,
take it.
you
So
yeah.
there's different parts of the cost here. So the notebook where you're generating some of the population genetic analyses is going to scale linearly. And I estimate with 1,000 samples using a VCF that's similar to something that you would receive from TopMed for that to be around $30. And then the association tests themselves will actually scale quadratically, which is important to note. However, with 1,000 samples, it's still under $1. So in total, a test run I did with 1,000 samples was around $32. However, if you're scaling up to much larger sample sizes, I would assume a GWAS with both of this interactive notebook steps and the association test workflows to be, in the thousands of dollars, if that's helpful.
And this is if you're able to start at the VCF stage, correct?
Yes, if you've already received a VCF and you're exploring the VCF and filtering for your needs, that's the starting point, yes.
Any additional questions for Anton? Anton, there's a question from the chat if you could differentiate between notebooks and workflows in Terra.
So I'm sorry, the question is how to differentiate, or?
What is the difference?
The difference is basically that notebooks afford a much quicker interactive way of launching code, whereas workflows are more like if you have a big pile of code and you want to just put it into a black box and come back in a while to see what you get back out of it. So the interactive analysis is often used as the development step. So if you want to run certain commands on sort of small batches just to see what your results are, you would do that in a notebook because you can see the outputs very quickly. Whereas once you've decided that a particular task is ready for Cromwell, then you would use a workflow because you expect that task to take a long time and be in need of a lot of parallelization. Does that answer the question?
Lisa, there's another question from the chat from Daniel. If we use preemptible nodes and some of them get co-opted, how to restart the jobs for a batch? Or maybe if for some reason one parallel job crashes in a batch.
I'm not exactly sure the answer to that. Does anyone else know for sure how Cromwell handles that? I believe the general answer is that Cromwell is built to handle those types of situations. So you ideally would have to do the least amount of babysitting. So those preemptibles, in theory, will only ever slow you down. They won't necessitate you going back and resubmitting your workflow, although there are situations when your workflow has been preempted so much that you do actually need to go.
I think that's right. I think there's built-in mechanisms, and I don't know how much that's related to call caching.
Yeah, it is.
I would say, look, I feel like I remember writing an article on that. I would search our documentation on search for preemptibles and call caching, and I feel like there's something in there with more detail.
So basically, if your question is, does setting preemptibles mean that to save money, I'm running the risk that my workflow will just not happen and I have to keep going back and resubmitting it because I wanted to save money by putting in preemptibles. It shouldn't work that way. The preemptibles may make it take longer because you've allowed other jobs to hop the queue in front of you. But the way the preemptibles are built into Cromwell is supposed to mean that it'll still finish.
I actually have a specific example of it working in as that way. So you can, in the WDL, depending on how the WDL is set up, you can actually set it up to say, try preemptibles X number of times. And then once it goes over X, then try without preemptibles. So that could be the case if you have one of those jobs that runs, Google starts shutting down preemptibles after roughly 4 hours, and the hard limit is roughly 24 hours. So if you have one of those jobs that's kind of borderline on that 24 hours mark, you can set it to try a preemptible. If that fails, then it will try a not preemptible, and Cromwell handles that perfectly fine. So you don't have to resubmit. You just need to make sure your WDL is set up to handle that.
Excellent, thank you.
Does it start the job all over from the beginning or from where it left off?
It does not start the job all over. I don't, the one that I'm referring to, I think it's done on like a task level. I think it's on the, like the task level of the WDL. So for the example, what I was talking about was an aligner. If the alignment step fails on a preemptible, it will restart the alignment step, but it will not do the pre-alignment a second time because that's already completed.
Good to know.
Additional question coming in the chat. How easy is it to work with IGV?
Great question. The IGV that is native to Terra, that you can see the option for example, right here. So if I select one of these and click here to open with, IGV is one of the options. Obviously, it won't work in this particular case for sure. So, right, we have no valid files selected. But in theory, this is how you would do it. And the implementation, sometimes we find bugs in it, and we have to work on it. So it doesn't always work perfectly. The one that's native to Terra. However, you can always use IGV locally on your computer with the Terra bucket. So that's very easy to do. And actually, if you were to look through our documentation knowledge base and find where we have our workshop materials for our 4-day workshops, there are tutorials that specifically involve using IGV. And those tutorials are based on notebooks, but the IGV that they use, you're supposed to download onto your own machine, and then it gives you instructions for how to put the correct Google buckets that you're using with your workspace into the IGV. So the desktop IGV works perfectly well with the data that is stored in the cloud through Terra.
All right, thank you so much. I think we'll move on to the next session at this point.